Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President and Executive Director of the National Building Museum, Eileen Fuchs.
Hello, good evening, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Eileen Fuchs. I'm the President and Executive Director of this National Building Museum, and it's just my absolute honor and joy to have everyone here tonight for one of our most special events. The museum, if you don't know, is established by an act of Congress, and we serve as our nation's cultural home for the built environment. We explore how the places around us are created, who is behind them, and the influence they have on our daily lives. Here at the museum, we believe something simple but powerful. The world we design and build matters. It reflects our values, it shapes our experiences, and tells the story of who we are and who we hope to become. And that's exactly why the Vincent Scully Prize and tonight's celebration also matters so deeply to us. Tonight, as we recognize Barry Bergdoll as our 2025 Vincent Scully Prize laureate, we continue the tradition of honoring those who work in architecture, historic preservation, and urban design, and exemplifies excellence in practice, scholarship, and criticism. As a curator, historian, and educator, Barry has brought architecture into the public conversation. He has helped audiences see buildings not just as objects, but as part of a larger story, one that reveals how social, cultural, and political forces influence the environments we live in. To truly appreciate Barry's achievement tonight, it really helps to understand the legacy of the Vincent Scully Prize itself, a prize that has celebrated visionary leaders here at the museum since 1999. Please join me in watching a brief video that really explains that inspiring history of this prize.
Established in 1999, the National Building Museum's Vincent Scully Prize is named for the esteemed professor whose teaching and scholarship has inspired generations of architects, urban planners, and countless others, showing us not only how to see buildings, but how to connect architecture to the rest of our lives. Awarded annually by the museum, the Vincent Scully Prize recognizes exemplary practice, scholarship, or criticism in architecture, historic preservation, and urban design. The prize's inaugural committee was formed by seminal figures in American architecture, including I.M. Pei, Frank Gehry, and Stanley Tigerman. Each year, the prize jury identifies new ways of thinking about where we live, advancing a larger, shared dialogue across generations. After first honoring Scully himself, the award was bestowed upon urbanist, author, and activist Jane Jacobs, whose revolutionary writings championed community life as the heart of neighborhood vitality. Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, architects, planners, and theorists, were honored for their groundbreaking approaches to context, learning from the richness of existing surroundings. And His Highness the Aga Khan IV was celebrated for amplifying architecture that addresses the needs and aspirations of communities across the world. For over 25 years, the museum has celebrated those who shape the built environment, advancing public knowledge and ensuring discussions remain relevant and timely, encouraging wider dialogue. The prize recognized architecture critic Paul Goldberger, who taught us that architecture is not just about buildings, but about all of culture and community. For his work enriching public and civic life, we recognized landscape architect Laurie Olin. More recently, we celebrated architect, scholar, and writer Mabel Wilson for her contributions to our understanding of how race, culture, and history are embedded in the built environment. And landscape designer, artist, and educator Walter Hood for revealing the beauty and inherent possibilities of areas that remain unseen. Tonight, the museum and the prize jury are honored to recognize architectural historian and curator Barry Bergdoll for bridging academic scholarship with public engagement, emphasizing architecture's place within broader culture and history. His bold exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art and beyond brought pressing issues to the forefront, helping us see the built environment with new eyes. The National Building Museum continues to steward the legacy of the Vincent Scully Prize, honoring generations of those who challenge the boundaries of the built environment, recognizing that it is more than physical structure. It is inseparable from the places where our lives unfold. It is where communities forge connection, find purpose, and imagine new possibilities. Where we dialogue with our history, our lives today, and the futures we strive to build.
Each year, the prize is awarded through a thoughtful nomination and selection process overseen by an esteemed jury. This year's jury was chaired by Paul Goldberger, architecture critic and contributing editor at Vanity Fair and an incredible human. He is joined by Nancy Levinson, editor and executive director of Places Journal, Steve Luani, director of the University of Arkansas Community Design Center, Toshiko Mori, architect and professor in the practice of architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, and Andrea Roberts, preservation planner and associate professor of urban and environmental planning at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. And it was my honor to participate as a non-voting member. I'd now like to welcome Steve Luani to say a few words about the legacy of Vincent Scully and this prize. Steve?
Well, good evening and welcome. It is my pleasure to offer a brief reflection on Vincent Scully as the National Building Museum honors Barry Bergdoll with the Vincent Scully Prize. Acclaimed architect Philip Johnson once observed that Vincent Scully was the most influential architectural teacher ever. Scully, the Yale scholar, deeply influenced generation of design and non-design students alike who would either build or commission great architecture. Scully, the public intellectual, shaped the national discourse on the built environment for over 60 years, and his counsel mattered. Indeed, Scully's last lecture as Yale's Sterling Professor of the History of Art and Architecture was reported on the front page of the New York Times. Among his many honors, Scully was recognized twice by Time magazine as one of the best 10 college professors in the U.S. Good teachers are skilled at delivering insight and critical feedback, but great teachers, like Vincent Scully, are compasses. They connect the dots before our eyes, changing how we see the world. Scully did this through vigorous imagination and wit. Wit puts two things together that did not seemingly belong together. Wit was key to Scully's interpretive approach, which he called visual empiricism, an empiricism that fostered empathic understandings of people and places. Through wit, Scully upended the notion of time and historical processes. Like his mentor, the Yale historian Henri Fauchelevent, Scully resisted singular and fixed meanings, railing against what he saw as the linear reductive methods in historiography. Nearing retirement, Scully reflected on his approach, and I quote, "The iconologists of the period tended to trace forms to their original appearances, while for Fauchelevent, it all swept forward, and meaning changed as society changed. So the forms were alive, living their own life, creating a history of their own, sometimes shaping families across time. Anything was possible. I suppose I've been trying to be a Faucheleventist all my life." And Scully would earlier observe in a very important statement and a very telling statement that everything in the past is always waiting to detonate. Through wit, Scully combined the roles of the historian and the architectural critic, an unorthodox notion that the historian should shape architecture's future. Scully, the historian, pioneered a still unrivaled history of proto-modern American architecture in the shingle style and the stick style. Then Scully, the critic in his book, The Shingle Style Today, or The Historian's Revenge, championed the contemporary architects most worthy of shaping the future. He was Frank Lloyd Wright's most ardent advocate when others saw Wright as only a historical footnote. Through wit, Scully reopened to architects the wonders of history abandoned under mid-century's anti-historicist attitudes. He made Yale the place to study architecture as a humanistic discipline. He reignited the regard for the vernacular and classical traditions and pop culture, dislodging modern orthodoxy. Yet Scully always reinforced the promise of the modern project, arguing that invention depends upon history. And through wit, Scully the activist mobilized audiences nationwide to care about their cities as the city was being dismantled by urban renewal and the superhighway in the 1960s. Scully refashioned architecture's self-image, arguing that architecture is the construction of the environment, not single buildings. The city, he concluded, was the ultimate work of art. And Scully was one of the first to tell us to never trust a Department of Transportation. Scully, the great writer, that compass who connected past, present, and future, was both consequential and controversial. As Yale historian Eva Lisa Pelkanon observed, Scully favored poetic license over positivist factuality when tracing visual affinities, which drew its share of criticism. But historian Keith Egenar reflects what we all felt, that even when Scully was wrong, he was stirringly, scintillatingly wrong. So we reaffirm the words of that late, great American historian, David McCullough, who declared not too long ago that Vincent Scully is a national treasure. So I now turn the podium over to Paul Goldberger, our jury chair, and the 2012 recipient of the Vincent Scully Prize.
Thank you, Stephen. I must say, as one who studied with Scully, you got both his strengths and his extraordinary, brilliant, and amazing liabilities exactly right. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here to speak on behalf of the jury, which, as you know, earlier this year voted unanimously and enthusiastically to select Barry Bergdoll as this year's recipient of the Vincent Scully Prize. The jury's report to the National Building Museum's Board of Trustees was effusive in its praise. And if I may quote from it for a minute, it began by saying, Barry Bergdoll is one of the world's most eminent architectural historians, and for that alone, he would be an appropriate recipient of the Scully Prize. But the jury then went on to observe that, and I quote again, we took special note, however, of the extent to which his career has been devoted not solely to scholarship, but also to public outreach, which is consistent with the commitment of the Scully Prize to honoring scholars, writers, and public figures who have shaped public understanding of the built environment. Barry Bergdoll has consistently presented architecture not as hermetic, but as enmeshed in wider issues of society, politics, economics, and culture. The jury particularly recognizes Bergdoll's transformative tenure as Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art, beginning at the pivotal moment of the 2008 financial crisis, at a time when architectural exhibitions tended to be highly specialized, often focused on the work of a single architect. Bergdoll mounted exhibitions that brought key social issues to the forefront, helping to redefine the museum's role for the public. Among his paradigm-shifting exhibitions were the ones like Rising Currents, Projects for New York's Waterfront, and foreclosed Rehousing the American Dream. His exhibitions were forward-thinking, unpredictable, and framed to make architecture consequential to a broader audience. Engaging a wide spectrum of collaborators, he brought important new subjects into the public discourse around architecture. As a public intellectual and architectural historian, he has also supported young scholars and mentored generations of practitioners. The Vincent Scully Prize celebrates all his contributions, including his own important scholarship on European architectural history, as well as the significant ways he's helped the public see architecture anew. I can add to this only what a personal pleasure it is for me to have Barry as our honoree this year. He has been a colleague for many years on the advisory council that oversees Philip Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut, where I've long considered his wisdom, knowledge, and collegiality to be a key reason that serving on that board is such an ongoing pleasure for me. Barry's also central to the community of architects and architectural historians of New York, but also of the country and, to be fair, the world. He's as vital to the discourse in Paris as he is on 116th Street or on Eastern Long Island. And beyond academia, he's always epitomized the notion of the engaged scholar, the scholar for whom the pursuit of knowledge is inseparable from the challenge of building a more civilized world, the values that Vincent Scully always represented and that Barry Bergdoll carries into the 21st century. If I can now ask the rest of the other jury members who are here and Eileen to join me again on the platform, and we will present the award. Thank you.
Fantastic. You guys can move over there. Okay. We should have a drum roll, I feel like. On behalf of the National Building Museum, I'm so honored to present the Vincent Scully Prize of 2025 to Barry Bergdoll. Please join us. Ooh. I will now present you the award. Who's gonna want to stand? Got it.
I think it'll take me a moment to gather my thoughts and emotions after that praise. Thank you so much, Paul. I would love to know that person who can live up to what you've just said. I'm an art historian. I can't speak without images, so I will be looking to make sure that they are accompanying me. But it is, besides being daunting to be in this space, such an enormous honor to have been chosen to be the 2025 recipient of this award and to join such a roster of figures who have helped shape the architectural culture of our country in the last 2.5 decades. Nearly every previous recipient has inspired me and helped craft my own trajectory in scholarship and public engagement with architecture. It is moving to find my names joining theirs. When I was a student, Vincent Scully was, along with only a handful of others, like his close contemporary William Jordy, the gold standard of an architectural historian who inspired as much in lecture halls as through his engagement with the issues and the challenges of the day. I remember vividly his participation in a public debate organized by the Architectural League of New York in a jam-packed auditorium to debate the extensions proposed to Louis Kahn's Salk Institute in La Jolla. Of course, the raucous room fell silent when Scully spoke so movingly, his eyes, as in this image, beginning to tear up at the mere evocation of the beauty of Kahn's space a continent away. And who can forget his lines on the massacre of McKim-Mead White's Penn Station, a demolition the consequences of which we are still living with today. And indeed, demolitions have as much consequence as we are feeling today. as constructions. But who could forget those, even as the desperately needed infrastructure for this place, for Penn Station as a transportation hub, has once again become hostage to destructive politics. Scully understood that the urban fabric of our country is not only where the physical crafting of space and place shapes, and is shaped by the decisions we make about the form of our society and polis, but equally, it is a fabric continually being woven, shaped by the present, even as the decisions of the present are crafting the strands out of which possible futures can be fabricated. I still have my heavily underlined, highlighted, and annotated paperback copies of Jane Jacobs' Life and Death of Great American Cities and of Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. The tie is in reference to that. Purchased as a high school student when exploring my native Philadelphia was my greatest passion. In college at Columbia in the 1970s, Ada Louise Huxtable's columns had us standing at the newsstand, remember newsstands, on Saturday nights to be among the first to read her in the Sunday morning New York Times, generally available around 11 p.m. on Saturday night. The columns of the precocious and insightful Paul Goldberger followed during my graduate school years. What an honor to be selected by a jury led by Paul and others I admire so much, Toshiko, Nancy, Stephen, and Andrea. Thank you so much. I am deeply moved by your enthusiasm for my work, since I have so much for yours. I began my trajectory in curating and creating exhibitions in the late 1980s, thanks to another laureate, Phyllis Lambert's vision at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and thanks to her never-ending trust and support of younger people. I was thrilled to curate one of the very first exhibitions at the CCA's new building in Montreal when it opened in 1989, the bicentennial of the French Revolution, an exhibition you see here both in an installation shot and a view of the catalog, and an exhibition that traced the political vicissitudes of a single monument that was systematically and polemically changed in function and form with each change of regime for over a century, from the mid-18th to the end of the 19th centuries. In short, the Scully Award is in many ways for me a personal genealogy of my convictions about the role of an architectural historian, not only in the academy, but in society. And I am deeply honored that the jury felt I belong with this group, which includes such insightful and splendid friends and colleagues as Mabel Wilson, who I had the pleasure of working with on the exhibition Frank Lloyd Wright, Unpacking the Archive at MoMA in 2017. What I want to talk about this evening, briefly, has only gained in urgency in the months since I was stunned in the spring to receive notice of this award, and tonight, my first trip to our nation's capital, since it has been occupied by National Guard, gridlocked by an ineffectual Congress, largely beholden to donors rather than voters, and now subjected to major architectural decisions taken seemingly by a single individual, but affecting the buildings which house our public functions and embody in their form the history of American democracy. One thinks of the observation in Sophocles' Antigone, a city that is of one man only is no longer a city. It is interesting to remember that the choice of the design for the People's House, the White House, was the result of a design competition in 1792, 230 years ago, the first ever held in the young new nation. And this, since such an exercise with only a few precedents in the history of architecture, a competition, was thought to partake of the institutions of democratic decision-making that were being embedded in the Constitution, which had been adopted but 2 years earlier when Rhode Island was the last state to ratify it. From the 6 entrants to that competition, President George Washington and 3 commissioners chose the design of James Hoban, a recent immigrant from Ireland. Hoban's apprentice years in Ireland saw the first ever competition organized in the United Kingdom, in which the entire decision-making for a new royal exchange, in this case you see on the screen, in the country's then second largest city, later to serve, as it still does today, as Dublin City Hall, that entire process played out in the public realm, from newspaper announcements and articles to a public exhibition that preceded the selection of the project you see here by Thomas Cooley in 1769. We might note also that following the American lead,
the French revolutionary government in 1794 opened a set of competitions for architects to design buildings for a new societal order of a post-monarchical society, the famous competitions of the Revolutionary Year II. I am showing you here a rather idealistic and, of course, unrealized project. Don't go looking for it. In Paris, it doesn't exist, for a temple to égalité, equality. This was the first architectural exhibition ever to be accompanied by a printed catalog, as far as I know from my current research in the history of architectural exhibitions. In all of these decisions, the difficult balance between design expertise and public engagement that remains to this day a complex equilibrium to achieve was set as an aspiration for a public architecture in which the public had a stake and a role. The role of the architectural exhibition as a venue for opening public discussion, for creating an informed audience for architecture, for that art of which Winston Churchill so famously said, "We make our buildings and then they make us," is all the more vital in a moment when we see threats to open discourse proliferating as an ominous cloud of official and unofficial censorship of public discourse darkens the horizons of this city, this country, and beyond. Currently, I am bringing to conclusion a historical project that I've already evoked, which began here in Washington over a decade ago when I was invited to deliver the Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts at our National Gallery of Art. And I chose as my subject the history of the public exhibition of architecture. Under the title, which you need to see, you see here on the screen, Out of Sight, S-I-T-E, this is very important, Out of Sight, in Plain View, that series of lectures and future book takes on the well-known paradox of exhibiting architecture. Namely, that generally such a display has little to do with the scale, spatiality, or material qualities of buildings exhibited through an array of representations, drawings, and models since the earliest public displays of architecture. In the 18th century, increasingly photographs from the mid-19th century, and of course later film, video, and computer representations. From the first, the challenge has been how to engage a broad public in appreciating and forming opinions about the art form which most directly affects the qualities of their lives, individually, communally, and as citizens. To organize a chronicle of this paradoxical activity of exhibiting representations rather than objects, I like to say that exhibitions of architecture are generally exhibitions as much of architecture as about architecture, and they all depend, I think, on the key phrase of my title, which is this idea of taking something out of context that we might be able to look at it in a different way, perhaps a more nuanced way, perhaps temporarily an unexpected way. So to organize this chronicle of this paradoxical activity, I chose to identify and trace those benefits, not only for the art of architecture, but for the culture of architecture, a culture which includes not only the designers and makers of the buildings, but the people who experience them either in their daily lives or through travels to see them in situ. The architecture exhibition is, of course, like all modes of expression, written, verbal, and visual, neutral and flexible. It can be used to any number of ends and for any number of functions. In the book I am writing, I underscore the role exhibitions played, of course, as I've already evoked, in fostering public debate, enlarging public understanding, but also in the role of the evolution of architectural history itself as a discipline, allowing buildings to be organized into chronological sequences, as they rarely are in their found space, and into conceptual categories that expand understanding of the evolution of architecture and of its changing roles in society. I look at the role architecture played in the great world's fairs of the 19th and early 20th century, in crafting ideas of national identity and of exchanging technical knowledge, later, of course, rather negatively in enforcing colonialism, but in particular the role that exhibitions played in the development of reform movements, in search for better housing for workers and those in need. Here, a juxtaposition of the first, we'll come back to this, the first model house at the World's Fair of 1851 and the House of the Future at Disneyland, which proved to be difficult because the future kept catching up to it a bit too rapidly and it had to be redesigned more frequently than the House for the Working Class of London. And also the role of the exhibition in defining the modern profession of the city planner here a exhibition called the Better Philadelphia exhibition at the Gimbel's department store in the 1950s. And of course, I examine the intimate relationship between the idea of the avant-garde, the ability to project a different vision than present-day conventions, and the spaces of the gallery, or even sometimes the movement of exhibition outside the walls, as places of amazing exploration that often create architectures that did not yet exist in the environment, either to make possible a better future or at least to expand our minds in the present. But the role of persuasion has also meant that exhibitions have often been ideal media for propaganda. And one thinks of the roles of display, sometimes taken even as in here into the public realm, by newly installed regimes, from the utopian hopes of the early Soviet Revolution to what you see here, the menacing discourses of the early National Socialist regime in Germany. I think of the role of exhibitions in totalitarian regimes, from Hitler's marching of a large-scale model of his planned House of German Art through the streets of Munich, carried by members of the SS disguised as medieval artisans here. It was a building that was to become a major showcase for the public works, but also the racist ideology of the evolving regime. Or the great importance of exhibitions in fascist Italy, which ranged from celebrating Mussolini's regime's accomplishments in national infrastructure, in the creation of public buildings, to celebrating the rediscovery of vernacular Italian architecture as an inspiration for a modern architecture with a tradition other than the classicism that animated so much of the public building of that period. But of all the functions of an architecture exhibition, from retrospective celebrating a great architect, such as that staged in France in 1879, where there became a tradition to put on a memorial exhibition, this one for the recently deceased Viollet-le-Duc, the restorer of Notre Dame, and so many other national French treasures, to exhibitions like the one on the right, that opened a chance for architects to explore in temporary form spatial concepts and ideas that might generate future architects, such as here Friedrich Kiesler's Austrian entry to the 1925 Exposition des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, in which the armature for display was left in the end without further content to suggest a future space, a city in space, he called it. The one possibility, however, that I want to highlight tonight in the remainder of my remarks is the exhibition that brings a large lay public into an encounter with the spatial dimensions of issues that confront the community at whatever scale, from the neighborhood up, in our period of climate change, climate emergency, and threats to the planet. During the years that I served as Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at MoMA, and I love this photograph from the 1940s. It's as though they put the address on the roof in case Corbusier came back, he would know exactly where he needed to land in his helicopter. Anyway, during my years in that building, I both practiced and wrote about what I called the advocacy exhibition, an exhibition in which the museum did not select fine examples of what exists in the world, but seeks instead to instigate new responses to what could be, not necessarily to derive a blueprint, but to help catalyze a necessary discussion and raise awareness. I'm not so sure in the current climate that advocacy is in fact the right term, for my aim was never to take a position, but to open a conversation. The only advocacy was to raise awareness and cause an issue to be addressed. I spoke often about changing the boundaries of public discussion. In a world hidebound by predictable and often quite destructive partisanship, this could not be more important. Long before the founding of the National Trust for Preservation in 1949, or the passing of municipal landmark preservation laws, beginning with New York in 1967, museums played a role in creating a consciousness about preserving historical heritage, beyond that associated with landmarks of national history, like the movement to save Mount Vernon. We might point to what you see on the screen, the pioneering example, and this is actually typical of my research. Exhibitions are about the most poorly documented things. You have to look for scraps of paper. We can rarely actually find out what they look like except in verbal descriptions. But this one's fascinating. This was the pioneering preservation advocacy exhibition. This is Charleston, staged in 1942 at Charleston's Gibbs's Art Gallery. Charleston, the city, it might be noted, where James Hoban, architect of the White House, began his American career. Charleston staged a public display of the results of its first historical monument survey at a moment when real estate development pressures were leading to demolitions and a market for historic building fragments, which often fetched much higher price in individual parts than the whole building itself. Dismantling history had become lucrative. The show consisted of 34 panels that offered an analysis of the city and its problems, stressing issues of housing, traffic, public health, recreation, and the physical appearance of the urban environment, along with information on the groups who were advocating for the preservation of heritage. It ended with a wall mirror that made visitors themselves part of the display, hung under the question, who is responsible for Charleston's future? In 1952, as the Young Society of Architectural Historians, founded in 1940, was preparing for its annual meeting in New York City, just as the results of a first survey by the Municipal Arts Society were being tabulated. A report was issued, of course, a government report, municipal report, an advocacy report, but much more effective was an exhibition staged, 30 new buildings most worthy of preservation at the Museum of the City of New York. The display ended not with a mirror this time, but with a ballot box at the exit from the display. Among the highest number of votes went, interestingly, to the youngest building, the Woolworth Building. An exhibition, in short, need not be entirely passive. To display architecture is not to display works of art in which one wants to cultivate an atmosphere of quiet reverence for individual contemplation. The architectural exhibition is as public as architecture itself. When I arrived at MoMA, this is not MoMA, but we will get to MoMA in a minute. When I arrived at MoMA in 2007 as a historian, I found myself in a rare, spare moment in the museum's incredible archives. The role of that museum in joining a decades-old use of exhibitions to advocate for better housing conditions was particularly inspiring in the files I was going through. Historically, of course, this takes us back at least to the famous model that you see in the top left, the model workers' house by the architect Henry Roberts, sponsored by Prince Albert and displayed across the street from London's Crystal Palace in 1851. And it takes us via the Paris World's Fair of 1900, evoked in the lower left, where the Tenement House Committee of the charity organization Society in New York exported their highly instrumental exhibition, first shown on Fifth Avenue, on the situation of overcrowding and appalling conditions in tenements in Lower Manhattan. Continuing a campaign begun with the publication, you see some examples on the right, of Jacob Riis's infamous muckraking photographs in How the Other Half Lives. It is too often forgotten that the famous inaugural architecture exhibition of the then 3-year-old Museum of Modern Art, which took place in the Crown Building that you see on the left of the left-hand slide, Modern Architecture International Exhibition in 1932, was not only an attempt to shift American tastes away from the perennial popular colonial revival style, from everything from small suburban houses to bank branches, towards an architecture of experimentation with the new, but it was also a platform advocating for a response to the housing crisis. All but one of the galleries on the display on the 12th floor of the Crown Building on the corner of 57th and 5th Avenue, today used, those very galleries, by the super luxurious Aman Hotel, featured models and identically sized photographs of modern buildings of the last decade, mostly European, that the curators Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson saw as the emergence of an epochal new style for the 20th century. Of course, you all recognized, you get credit on the exam, which will be given right after the lecture, the Dessau Bauhaus by Walter Gropius and Adolf Meyer, extra credit if you know. Adolf Meyer actually designed it. And I couldn't resist showing you the first page of the exhibition's catalog with its statement on the power of architectural exhibitions to shape practice. And I read it from here. Expositions and exhibitions have perhaps changed the character of American architecture of the last 40 years more than any other factor. Of course, it was written by future curators. But the final gallery, in large part entrusted to Lewis Mumford, and I would say, Diane, that if the National Building Museum had existed in the 1930s, Lewis Mumford would certainly have had this award. That last gallery, which you see here, took a daring approach of juxtaposing photographs meant to shock visitors who avoided contact with housing conditions of New York's poor immigrant neighborhoods with one of the most successful landscape housing projects, here represented in model, recently completed in Kassel in Germany. 2 years later, the inspirational young housing advocate, Catherine Bauer, whose book Modern Housing was to remain a crucial reference, joined forces with Mumford and the museum to stage the first of several exhibitions advocating for public housing, not only in New York, but in America. Into a former townhouse of the Rockefeller family at 11 West 53rd Street, still the address of MoMA, they transported the living room of a slum dwelling, you can just make it out on the left there in the distance, being demolished in Yorkville on the Upper East Side, then one of Manhattan's poorest districts, to the museum, initially replete with cockroaches, at least until the health department asked for their removal. And they juxtaposed it with a future period room, a healthy and air-filled space for living in the same dimensions, but having a copy of the International Style book on the coffee table. Galleries used innovative and stirring graphics and photo murals to explain the housing crisis, and even displayed a model for model housing for Christie Street on the Lower East Side. And it ended with a room where visitors could have conversations with trained docents on the finances of a mortgage and other housing questions. The press discussion was intense. Historians have long credited this exhibition, along with Bauer's writings, with the passage of both municipal and federal legislation, of course not the only factor, to engage government in social welfare, realizing along with the help to needy families that the health of the polis as well improved when slum conditions were not quietly accepted or ignored. During World War II, there's another one of the pamphlets that came out. Of course, the answer to the question was, yes, it can. During World War II, MoMA, like many museums, joined in the effort of envisioning the post-war period and new possibilities for alliances between local decision-making and federal assistance and guidelines. This was the type of curatorial engagement that also planned for public engagement that I sought to revive at MoMA when I arrived in 2007. I would like, in closing, if you'd be patient, to speak briefly of two exhibitions which I hoped could serve as a template for a renewal of an advocacy position, which the museum had held strongly in the years on either side of World War II, and indeed during the war, as it sought to support the war effort. There is another example, get to in a moment. Rising Currents, Projects for New York's Waterfront, which has already been evoked and which you'll see in a moment, of 2009-10, and Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream, of 2012. I have written about these efforts both in the prefaces to the books that accompanied the displays and in articles responding to the fascination with curating that has taken hold in the last decade or so in the Academy. But key for me was the participatory nature. Once before, that's what this slide evokes, once before in 1967, MoMA had organized an exhibition soliciting new design ideas as a critique of wholesale tabula rasa urban renewal, a show which criticized reigning orthodoxies in federal administration, even as the critique was growing in many quarters. 4 teams from leading East Coast architecture, there you see the sites, 4 teams from leading East Coast architecture schools were invited to propose alternative approaches, partly preservation, in 4 districts of Upper Manhattan and the Lower Bronx. And the results were put on display in the summer of 1967, summer being considered that time a period with low attendance, and a symposium was held, and despite relatively limited attendance, the press reception was significant. My approach built on what I called MoMA's advocacy tradition, a tradition which included advocacy for community planning in the years immediately after World War II. But my approach had some key differences. First of all, I was interested in how to engage the public in viewing design thinking, design in process, design as a way of thinking, rather than putting representations of finished architecture or projected architecture onto pedestals, as though they were sculptures to be admired as works of art in their own right. This is an approach I first developed in thinking about how the internet could not be a substitute, but rather an ally of a physical exhibition. In the rather ridiculously ambitious exhibition that you see here on the screen, Home Delivery Fabricating the Modern Dwelling, in 2008, in which 5 prefabricated houses were developed for display on the outdoor lot now home to a Jean Nouvel design skyscraper that partly includes MoMA's expanded galleries. The display included a historical survey of factory-made reproducible architectures for housing in the interior of the museum, and an outdoor display of 5 full-scale prototypes, including the 4-story tall cellophane house developed, you see on the far right, by the Philadelphia firm of Kieran Timberlake, who imagined a house of energy-capturing panels for a house that would be could completely move off the grid. What the 5 buildings had in common was that they were factory-produced and delivered to our site. Home delivery, which I stole from the New York Times actually, thus came to include what we might call the larger temporal margins of the exhibition, to the experience of public engagement with the issues of fabrication and dwelling. What I mean by that was months before, here's the interior display of the history of it. Here is the actual arrival, so it was quite a spectacle of the arrival of these deliverable homes. But most importantly here is the role of the internet, which I decided was not necessarily our competitor, but our friend in public engagement. So months before the display actually opened between 53rd and 54th Street, an internet site was opened which allowed the public from home to read weekly updates on the progress of each house, as of yet invisible in Manhattan, as it moved from design studio to factory production to delivery via ship, truck, and crane, partly involving the closing of the George Washington Bridge, but we weren't put in jail for that, to a site on West 54th Street. All the while, as you see in the far right of all those boxes, all the while that a live camera, kind of Andy Warhol-like, showed an empty site waiting for the days before the exhibition when the homes finally appeared on the screen. During and for months after the exhibition, the website switched, and it remained open for invited editorial blogging, as well as towards the end for public comments to animate the debate. To inaugurate a new genre of exhibition in which the public was engaged in the thought process of architectural designs that respond to contemporary urgencies, we moved on after this to an even more participatory approach. In the case of Rising Currents in 2009-10, I took a body of research that the engineer and design advocate Guy Nordenson and his associates, landscape architect and historian Catherine Sievett and architect Adam Urinsky of ARO, had developed on how to respond to the threats that rising sea levels and more frequent and devastating storms caused by climate change have been occurring. And I proposed, rather than displaying, as they had suggested, what they were about to publish on the walls, that instead we activate their analysis and mount an interdisciplinary design workshop to which the public would be invited to view the design work in the making, almost as one might have a site visit to an important building under construction. The context was the global financial, here are the sites, and here's the research report which we published for the team of 3 and then gave to 5 different teams. The context was the global financial crisis of 2008, a moment perilous for so many, and not the least for the young architectural talent that is one of the concerns of a museum that always defined itself as promoting the art of our time. With help from the Rockefeller Foundation, we offered stipends to teams who could bring together a variety of expertise, architecture, landscape, hydraulics, ecology, that are not always brought together in response to design briefs in a competitive market setting. They were supported just for 8-week residencies at MoMA's PS1. Here's the analysis from that report on floodable zones where the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers proposed to place dams. Here are the 5 sites that they chose, and here we have the teams moving into residence at MoMA's PS1, the Contemporary Art Center across the East River in Long Island City. Then Director Klaus Biesenbach told me he was going to have to close some galleries due to the financial crisis. I said, give them to me. I'm going to put architects in them, and they're going to work. And during that time, I organized weekly pin-ups, you see in the upper left, with invited experts and people from various city agencies. Not that the city was the commissioner, the design teams working on contract, but to help the designers fulfill my mandate to them to come up with schemes, as I said at the time, realistic enough that they can't be dismissed, visionary enough that they can't be forgotten. 2 times, you see on the lower left, we threw open the doors of the studios at PS1 on open house days to the public, who came in droves once some friendly messages on Twitter, still then a respectable medium, let a very young audience know what was happening. Designing the show was part of the workshop, with members of MoMA's exhibition design department attending our twice-weekly working sessions at PS1. This not only fast-tracked the whole experiment, which went from selection of teams through an open call and interviews to opening the exhibition in under 5 months, it also meant that communication was a key part of the strategy. For open house days, I asked the teams to dry run their presentations, to draw their attention to the shorthand language and terminology that we have in architecture, which is sometimes opaque for a general public, and part of the obstacle of the type of respect for design thinking I was aiming to have the show achieve. Once the show was installed, we set up a computer terminal in the gallery to invite visitors to join a blog responding to both the show and to various expert blogs that were regularly posted. And with the Center for Architecture of the New York chapter of the AIA, we organized a series of boat tours to visit the sites that were studied. Many discovered parts of the city they scarcely knew, even as they came face to face with the threats of rising sea levels. In galleries one day, I overheard some visitors from Staten Island saying that they had never before seen MoMA aware of the existence of their borough. I can only pass in review here some images of the projects at the risk of taking the rest of the evening to discuss some of the brilliant results that these young architectural teams with interdisciplinary landscape and hydraulic advice as integral parts of their projects produced. Results, it must be said, which have inspired some implementation and many other studies, some supported 2 years later by the federal government in a big project for East Coast resiliency. Here we have a view of the show and another view of it, this project for spikes to be thrown into the shallow waters to create sea reefs to break storm surge velocity. Here, one of the projects for rethinking Lower Manhattan for precisely that same reason, rethinking the design of streets as part of that project, and some of the others. The book is published now. We published it after the fact. That's why it's a rare exhibition catalog that has views of people in the exhibition and the exhibition itself, but you can study the projects in that book if you like, or I come in another occasion and we can talk about the threat of water. The show closed its doors almost exactly 2 years before Superstorm Sandy inundated parts of Manhattan, at which point I was invited to the Mayor's Office of Emergency Preparedness, and I was asked a question when I arrived late. We were interested to know, we loved the show, what do you think of doing next? I said, what do you think of doing next? The city's just been flooded. I'm only a curator. All I can do is try to extend the boundaries of discourse. So I'm going to go through these. I would have loved to discuss them with you. Amazing results that these teams of people produced in just an 8-week residency. This is Kate Orff's project for installing oysters to both clean the water and create, again, reefs for breaking. We learned so much about the action on the seafloor and how it can accelerate or decelerate wave velocity. And so Kate wanted oysters to do that work in this brilliant project. She even thought oysters might again be eaten in the Gowanus Canal. 2 years later, foreclosed Rehousing the American Dream, which I did with my Columbia colleague Reinhold Martin, was, like Rising Currents, based on the notion of displaying what sociologists sometimes call co-benefits. That's to say, solving a problem could also bring other desirables along with it. In this case, presenting a desirable future for a neighborhood rather than simply exposing the conditions that need addressing. Here we looked at the plight of suburban districts of the early 20th century that today have become first ring outside city centers, often leapfrogged over by developers aiming for more open land in exurbia. And in 2011-12, as we chose the sites to be study areas, neighborhoods revealed themselves with some of the highest rates of foreclosures. Again, our workshops became destinations, pop-ups in process exhibitions, and encounters between design teams and the public. For open house days, we invited then Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Sean Donovan, to visit. You can see we finally were getting almost crowded out of these working studios. That's the architect Michael Bell talking about his project. Here is Jeannie Gang, who was one of the team leaders, discussing with Sean Donovan what she was up to during his visit. He came, he offered to give remarks at the symposium at the conclusion of the open house day. He arrived in time to visit all the studios and then surprised us by throwing his prepared speech in a trash can and asking for a quiet place to rewrite what he had to say. Maybe he had arrived with a short policy speech, but on the spot he revamped it with an impressive engagement with the individual projects, given that he had trained in architecture before taking on public service. I was pleased that at least for a while, some colleagues at MoMA sought to extend it with exhibitions devoted to spatial issues of worldwide economic equalities, issues of racial injustice, and spatial arrangements. I took the idea to my next role as the two-term president of New York Center for Architecture, and I'm very happy that my friend and colleague Ben Prosky is here tonight, and we worked on this, to the Center for Architecture with its brilliant relationship, here's foreclosed as installed, and here we are in Greenwich Village, with the Center for Architecture with its brilliant relationship to the sidewalk of its Greenwich Village setting in the show, Reset Towards a New Commons, organized as we at the center tried to emerge from the suffering and trauma that I don't think we're fully out of the COVID pandemic. This, in closing, there's the Center for Architecture, this incredibly wonderful space. This was the dream of the early Romantic architects of the early 19th century. At the moment when the public museum, I wanted to bring you some columns to match your columns. Remember when the public museum was being defined as both an institution and a place. One thinks of the great Berlin architect Karl Friedrich Schinkel's design for a museum that would make available to the public the royal collections previously available only to those with an invitation to the palace. Schinkel designed a museum in which the ample vestibule atop the staircase that you see here was a gallery open to a view of the city. The city is a work of art, but also as a spectacle for contemplation. And he imagined fathers taking their sons to the museum, didn't seem to imagine that mothers could do the same, and friends looking together at both works of art and the nearby city in dialogue. Of course, as I just said, it is striking that he didn't conceive in 1820 of female visitors to the museum, but what interests me here is the German Romantic concept of the so-called Kunstkonversation, the art conversation. It could easily be an Architekturkonversation, an architecture conversation. It is a conversation sparked and facilitated by an encounter with what is on display, not to be admired in silent admiration, but to engage both for individual cultivation and for fostering a polis in which there is debate, exchange, and commitment. How humbling to receive this award in a space in our nation's capital where there is an institution committed to just those ideals, in a space that resonates with just such conversations. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dan. Philip is coming up tonight.
So I'm Nancy Levinson, one of the jury members of this year's Scully Prize, and I think you can see what a brilliant choice we made. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Philip Kennicott, who will be in conversation with Barry Bergdoll. I think for many of you, Philip Kennicott will need no introduction. For the past 15 years, he has been the art and architecture critic of the Washington Post. He has been widely honored for his critical writings, which include music, as well as art and architecture. And in 2013, he won the Pulitzer Prize in Criticism. In their award announcement, the Pulitzer jury praised his eloquent and passionate essays on art and the social forces that underlie it. Now, certainly these forces, social and otherwise, have become increasingly urgent in recent years, recent months, and so I read with great interest several of Philip's recent columns for the Washington Post. This past April, for instance, in one of several pieces on the ongoing attacks on the curatorial independence of the Smithsonian, Philip described decades of soul-searching on the part of the institution in an effort to, quote, undo profound acts of erasure in its presentation of American history. Philip then went on to characterize as audacious and destructive the efforts of political leaders to assert control over the museum sector and the larger American historical narrative. Now, in architecture, too, of course, we are seeing related efforts to claim control over the architectural discipline and to claim that the only appropriate style for federal architecture is classical. So it is against this backdrop of current and unfolding events that Philip Kennicott will engage this year's Vincent Scully Prize laureate Barry Bergdoll in conversation. So please join me in welcoming Philip Kennicott.
Thank you, Nancy. And congratulations, Barry. It's a pleasure. I get the fun part of this evening, which is to be in conversation. As a writer, as a critic, I've admired and enjoyed and learned enormously from the exhibitions, especially at MoMA. And I won't ask the question exactly this way, but if I were to ask it sort of off the record, I say, how did you get away with it? Maybe a smarter way of asking that would be to put the exhibitions you did in some of the context that Paul mentioned. The financial collapse and the rise of a real critique of MoMA, Occupy Wall Street, kind of a decade or more of looking at MoMA with a great deal of suspicion. And yet you're coming in and trying to do what you call the advocacy exhibition. I'm wondering what sort of pushback you had within the institutional culture of MoMA for that notion of advocacy.
Well, I won't say it wasn't a rocky road, but the idea emerged actually from a workshop I had attended about social engagement that was organized in part by my great friend Darren Walker, who was then at the Rockefeller Foundation. And when I had the idea with Guy Nordenson and his associates who had prepared the report, they had come to me and said, don't you think this report is wonderful? Couldn't we make it into an exhibition? And I said, I don't do books on the wall, sorry. But we'll publish it if you want, and then we'll give it to others. And I just told that story. And happily, I went to Darren Walker at the Rockefeller Foundation, and I said, I have this idea. I need your support. So I actually he is one of the secret weapons here. I have to give him credit. He gave us enough money to keep the lights on in those spaces in PS1. It happened also to coincide with the moment when Klaus said we're going to close several galleries. I said, it doesn't need to look that way. We can actually use them. So I arrived with some money, but it was a bit of a rocky road. We installed the teams. A rocky road because it was so fast-tracked that a couple of times I was called into the museum administration to say, you're going to break the camel's back with what you're doing. This is completely crazy. We can't keep up with you. And then, thank you, journalists, there was a completely out of the blue op-ed in the New York Times right after we had opened I put a wall up at MoMA with the sea devouring the city, and then a diagram of how to get to PS1 to attend these workshops across the East River. And this op-ed writer saw it, and it was during the time of a show that needed time tickets, and he had brought his son to see the show, and he couldn't get in. So they went looking at this Rising Currents material, and he wrote a op-ed called MoMA and the Rising Flood. And the next morning, suddenly my reputation had changed from troublemaker to out-of-the-box thinker, and the stars began to align. So it was not without a certain amount of resistance, but with the Rockefeller Foundation behind me, they weren't exactly going to turn away that grant.
Yeah, it's troubling for a lot of us to think about Darren Walker actually retiring from that position and what will come of the enormous good he's done in the museum world as the whole world. But when I asked about the culture of MoMA, it's not just money, and you sketched a history of MoMA in the years around the war in which they're taking a much more socially engaged position. And then they get to that sort of models on a pedestal. How does that happen? How do you get from Lewis Mumford bringing cockroaches into a museum to a sense that you're just looking at beautiful little objects that even the public may or may not be able to decipher or discern, but they have that kind of object quality?
Well, I think it's partly a historical question. I mean, and of course MoMA plays a role in this book that I'm writing on the history of architectural exhibitions. One of the difficulties, I think, for anybody who writes a history that involves the Museum of Modern Art is one is so dazzled by the bright light of what MoMA becomes that you forget what a fledgling small institution it was in the 1930s. No one even knew if it was going to exist by 1940. So I think the place was much more experimental in the opening years. It was very much backed by money that came from, once again, from the Rockefeller family. But it was a much more scruffy place, and we tend to project what we know about the MoMA of the 50s, 60s, and 70s as a powerhouse back on that period. The architecture and design department was always incredibly fragile. I found letters in the archives that say things like Alfred Barr saying, you know, I have always defended this department. And there were numerous times when the museum said, why do we have this department? They can't collect anything. You can't put buildings in the museum. People also assume that the Museum of Modern Art had a significant architecture collection. It didn't actually collect anything of any substance before the 1960s. So, you know, one has to, in a certain sense, recreate a much more youthful, incredible role that recently my former colleague Juliet Kinchin has written up of the role of activist women as curators. Many more women in the Department of Architecture and Design than in the other departments, and many of them doing very experimental things. I think because architecture and design was always seen as who knows how long this experiment is going to go on, that in the early years it was allowed to take chances. And I think there were internal tensions between the aestheticizing agenda of a Philip Johnson, who then gets eclipsed by his own right-wing politics, disappears from the scene, and a lot of this housing things are going on during the period when he needs to at least step out of the limelight. He doesn't ever really totally disappear. So the historian can explain some of that early history. Why things move away there, I think if my project was to write a history of MoMA, I would want to have a financial historian next to me. I would want to look at the forces of the Board of Trustees. I would want to look at what are the financial interests that are at play there, as in any museum. It has been the policy of the museum, which at the moment seems quite wise. I think it was Glenn Lowry's policy that the museum would not either seek or look for federal money. So there's never been a federal component of MoMA's budget, you know, for better or worse. I don't think that in recent years. That was clearly not the case around World War II, when the museum was extremely patriotically engaged with the war effort.
You were talking about the use of the internet at that time to sort of expand, open, get past the walls, have people engaged with things like the arrival of the units at home delivery and the particular places in the city that were subject to the design interventions for rising currents. I'm curious about a couple of technologies that have really sort of exploded since the time that you were starting to do that. And one would be video games, in which there seems to be kind of recurring fascination with making the individual person a designer and kind of an urban master planner. These are different forms of technology, and technologies will have a certain solipsistic quantity and a certain engagement. What do you think of video games as a way of doing that kind of engagement?
A little kind of footnote, interstice before I try to take on I've never played a video game, so I'm the least qualified to.
That's two of us.
I am the least qualified to respond to your question, but We did have a big debates on the design side of the collection when Paolo Antonelli wanted to begin to collect video games as forms of graphic design and invention. And indeed the museum has done so. One of the big stumbling blocks is that it's going to be impossible to play the early video games on the equipment that they were made for. So as a museum that thinks about originals and authenticity, this posed absolutely fascinating, if not totally insurmountable, philosophical questions. But I think it has more to do with the question, and guide me if I'm not grasping what's at the heart of this. What is the role of a museum in which people can engage with I think there's two aspects to yours. People can engage with even as a non-professional architect, with the design activity in an internet environment, and equally, what is the role for the museum when you can do anything and more at home? I think that I have to look up the date, but I think that the iPhone was introduced right around the moment that I went to MoMA. So you could say, what is the point? And it's also precisely the moment when everybody became a curator. I'm curating my wardrobe. I'm going to Walgreens today to curate my menus for next week. Anything you do is curating. So between the iPhone and the proliferation of curating activities, you might have said it's completely futile to take on this difficult activity of exhibiting architecture at the Museum of Modern Art in 2007, and I was thinking a lot about that. Yet the museum has never been more crowded. This is until the headlines were about the heist at the Louvre the other day. All the headlines are about the heist of the overpopulation of the Louvre. So how do we explain in the internet age when actually Google Art you can get into a pixel relationship with a Van Gogh that no museum guard would ever let you anywhere near that proximity? How do we explain the popularity of museums? So I think despite the amount of our lives and of gamers in particular that takes place in a screen activity where they often are in a community of people that they don't know, people have a real desire for authenticity and hence their fascination with original works of art, and also with places of actual encounter. Most people don't even go to the post office anymore. Where do people encounter other people that they don't know? So those are two amateur explanations of the continued vitality, at least of some museums. And so I kept thinking, how do you decide we're not going to create product museum which can compete with product internet space? How do you bring some of those together? And I think some of at least if you want collectively to experience some kind of spectacle or processing, it has something to do too with the rise of performance art, etc. People want something that is somewhat spectacular. Home delivery was blatantly spectacular. Buildings were being hoisted into place. Streets were temporarily closed at night for things to be pulled down. We were filming it all. The exhibition started with, because I always have a kind of seductive thing at the beginning, and any of you who saw it might remember that it was Buster Keaton's The Scene from Home Delivery, in which he's, from what was that called? 1 Week, in which he's trying to assemble a delivered kit house, and failing to do so because the jolted lover has misnumbered the boxes. And so we had that 4-minute sequence, and people were so seduced by this film, I think they thought they were going into a Buster Keaton show, and then they ended up looking at a show on the history of the industrial fabrication of architecture and its implications for today. So all of that, I suppose, is phase 3. I think people are still hungry for real spectacles in real space with real people who are not necessarily the hundreds of friends some of us have on Facebook who we've never met.
Right. You mentioned at the beginning of your remarks some of the changes in Washington. And now that I've got you, you're trapped. You're just going to have to put up with these questions because they're very much on the top, the minds of people today. There's discussion by the current administration of attempting to create a kind of unified federal style of architecture. And the justifications for that are a supposed consensus in the public about what people want, what they want the built realm to look like. They want classical buildings, they want historicist buildings. Do you sense that consensus in the public?
I don't think there's any consensus on anything in this country, and not on that either. I think there's a very vibrant engagement currently with classical architecture, well, the spectacular spaces that it can create. So I'm not an anti-classicist, if you will, but I don't understand why the federal government would have an exclusionary policy about artistic creativity in this country. I think is unconscionable.
Yes. I've been struck recently by one of the images, and it's an architectural image that's been widely disseminated in newspapers, on television, of the President of the United States looking at a model of an arch that he wants to build at the terminus of one of the most beautiful bridges in Washington. And it does evoke some of the history that you evoked in your remarks tonight about the sort of public display of architecture for political purposes. Democracies often seem to do deliberation and building slowly, inefficiently, with a lot of dissension. Authoritarian regimes use architecture as a kind of manifestation of competence, that they can get things done. Are we sufficiently able to demonstrate the power of democracies to solve the very problems that you were anatomizing in the exhibitions you were done?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the track record of this administration and of the president's previous time in the White House doesn't give us a great deal of evidence of contributions to the built environment. The Infrastructure Week never happened for 4 years. Major projects of tunnels and things that are desperately needed have been halted. So far, we only see an efficiency of destruction, no efficiency of construction. So I'm not even certain with what some see as a slide towards authoritarianism, if it's bringing some efficiency that overrides the sometimes frustrating efficiencies of democratic process. You asked about consensus. I mean, there's never, I think, in a democratic society, unanimity of opinion, but consensus is something that has to be built. It's not automatically out there. And some of those processes are about building consensus and building the confidence that even if something is built that is not what one would have liked, it's gone through a process in which people have been engaged in discussion. Maybe that's not the result that 25% of the people wanted, but that is their, these are the procedures that have been developed in this country and in other democracies, but in this country in soon to be a 250-year period, as we know. So, on the subject of the Triumphal Arch, since I am a historian, and a historian particularly with a long, many years of studying neoclassicism and enough course time in ancient Roman architecture to know the triumphal arches always designate triumph. So it's not exactly clear, and they generally are portals for returning armies to come home. So it's not quite clear what is meant to be received through this arch. So I find the arch rather threatening. Is this advanced planning for the aftermath of a war that's not yet been announced? I know it sounds funny, but this is, a triumphal arch means something. It means the return of a triumphal army.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you're building a triumphal arch at the same time you're advocating to win the Nobel Peace Prize. But that I can't unwrap that contradiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for agreeing to do this, for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Barry and Philip, for that enriching conversation. And I want to thank Steve and Paul and Nancy and Toshiko and Andrea for their contributions to the jury and to the museum team who steward the prize. And I want to especially recognize Diane Ryu Taylor, our Director of Public Programs, whose passion and commitment to the program is palpable in every part of the experience tonight. Please thank you, Diane. I'd like to thank the members of our Board of Trustees who are here tonight. I've seen David Hairsign and Connie and Josephine and John Means and Megan Ulrich and others. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for this audience for joining us. I see in our crowd tonight some of our most beloved and longtime members and partners and friends and scholars. I see our chairman of the DC City Council, Phil Mendelson, is joining us. Thank you so much. We thank you all so much for our support. We hope you had a wonderful time. I'm supposed to tell you that our gift shop, the best gift shop in DC is open, as well as some of our incredible exhibitions upstairs over here. If you come see Coming Together, it's an exhibit we just opened last month, Reimagining America's Downtowns. I hope you'll check it out. And our Visible Vault, our collections are also here, and a South 40. All open, all have fun now. Also, let's eat and drink. Please join me in the East Court. Thank you so much.